Wait, Elena! Why did you leave me?
I never wanted to leave you. Your mother...
My mother did what?
The ceremony will begin sharply at 1. You need to be ready for the cameras.
The limousine moves slowly through the heart of downtown Seoul, cutting through the dense rhythm of a city that never paused for anyone, not even for a man like Min Jun, the young billionaire CEO, whose name had long become synonymous with power, influence, and unreachable success. A man whose decisions moved markets and whose voice silenced boardrooms, yet inside that bulletproof silence of tinted glass and polished leather, there was no celebration in his chest, only a quiet ache that had lived there for 11 years without ever fully leaving him. Outside, the city had transformed into a living spectacle, streets packed with people waving and raising their phones as the most anticipated wedding in South Korea unfolded in real time. News helicopters circling overhead like restless witnesses, cameras streaming across every major network as if the whole country had agreed to pause and watch history being written in gold, glass, and celebrity. Inside the convoy, everything moved with military precision, armored cars ahead and behind, motorcycles flanking both sides, his assistant reviewing the ceremony schedule on a tablet and reminding him gently of timelines and cues he was no longer listening to, because his gaze had drifted somewhere beyond the glass, beyond the noise, beyond the world that had been so carefully built around him. For Min Jun, success had never been the problem. It was everything else that had slowly hollowed out inside him after the woman he loved disappeared without a word. Then the convoy slowed. Traffic thickened near a pedestrian crossing, where ordinary life continued despite the extraordinary event unfolding only meters away. Students laughing on their way somewhere, office workers hurrying with coffee in hand, a father lifting his daughter onto his shoulders so she could see the wedding cars pass by. And that was when he saw her, standing quietly at the crossing in a simple beige blouse and light trousers, a small bag resting on her shoulder, looking so grounded and so real that for a moment his mind refused to accept what his eyes were telling him. Elena. Her face had changed and softened with time, but there was something painfully familiar in the way she stood so still, something that pulled him backward through 11 years of unanswered questions. And beside her stood 3 boys, all around the same age, all sharing the same restless energy, the same posture, the same laughter held together by something he could not yet name. One of them was pointing excitedly at the street. Another was laughing loudly beside him. The third stood closer to Elena, holding gently onto her sleeve. In that single moment, without any proof and without any explanation, something inside Min Jun recognized them, not through logic, but through instinct, the way memory sometimes meets reality and simply refuses to let go again. His voice broke the silence inside the car before he even understood what he was about to do. "Stop the car," he said quietly, and then again, firmer, when the driver hesitated and his assistant turned to him in alarm to remind him the ceremony would begin in minutes. It was no longer a request. Before anyone could process what was happening, he had already opened the door and stepped out into the middle of a moving world. A groom in a tailored tuxedo, walking away from his own wedding, while security shouted behind him and reporters spun their cameras toward the sudden chaos. He didn't hear any of it. He was already walking toward her, and every step felt heavier than the last, as though he were crossing not a street, but an entire decade of silence and regret. Elena saw him coming and froze. Her bag slipped down her arm, and she caught it without ever taking her eyes off his face. The boys noticed the shift immediately, their laughter fading into a careful, watchful quiet, sensing that something important was happening, even though they did not yet understand what it was. And then Min Jun stopped in front of her, close enough to see everything, close enough that reality could no longer be avoided. "Elena," he said, and his voice came out low and broken in a way that surprised even him. Her lips parted, then closed again, like someone who had rehearsed this exact moment for years and had suddenly forgotten every word she meant to say. Then softly, she said his name back to him, and the world around them seemed to rush in all at once, security pushing forward, reporters shouting questions, drones dipping lower to catch every second of it, none of it mattering to either of them anymore. His eyes moved from her to the boys, then back again, and something inside him finally gave way. "Why did you leave me?" he asked, and the question landed like an old wound reopening. Elena closed her eyes briefly before answering, and when she opened them, there was no hesitation left in her at all. "I never wanted to leave you," she said. "Your mother made sure I had no choice." The words changed the air between them instantly. Even security seemed to slow. Min Jun stepped closer, asking her to repeat it, and she did, steady this time, though her voice shook slightly as the memory rose back to the surface. She told him that 11 years earlier, on one particular day when he had left for a business trip that was supposed to last less than a week, she had discovered she was pregnant, terrified and hopeful all at once, waiting for the right moment to tell him herself. But his mother, Lady Diane June, had reached her first, telling her plainly that she could see exactly what was happening between her and her son, her voice calm and composed in a way that frightened Elena more than shouting ever could, showing her photographs, videos, and messages arranged to look like proof that he was already engaged to someone else, telling her plainly that a poor young woman with no family of her own would never be accepted into their world, and that the kindest thing she could do for everyone, including him, was to disappear quietly before she ruined his future. "I was young, and I was scared, and I believed her," Elena said, her voice cracking on the last word. "I left that same night with nothing, no money and no phone, because I couldn't bear the thought of forcing my way into a life where I wasn't wanted. I tried, later, to reach you twice, through an old number and through a letter that was returned unopened, and after that, I told myself I had to stop trying, for my own sake and for theirs, and I built the only life I could out of what was left." She told him how she had been crying on a quiet street corner that same night when an elderly stranger named Grandma Mira had stopped her car, taken her in without asking a single question she wasn't ready to answer, and cared for her through the following months until the boys were born safely under her roof. "They are yours," Elena finally said, looking toward the three boys who stood watching them both with wide, uncertain eyes. "Liam, Noah, and Ethan. They have always been yours." For a moment, standing there on that crowded street, Min Jun was pulled backward into a memory he had buried for 11 years. A small rooftop cafe where he and Elena had first met, back when he was still a junior executive nobody recognized on sight, and she was a young woman working 2 jobs to pay her way through night school. He remembered how she had laughed at something clumsy he said, how she had never once asked him for anything, how being with her had felt like the only honest hour in an otherwise calculated life. He remembered waiting outside that same cafe every evening for a month before she finally agreed to have dinner with him, and how, for the 2 years that followed, she had been the only person in his life who wanted nothing from his name and everything from the person underneath it. Losing that, he realized now, standing in front of her again, was the true tragedy of the last 11 years, far heavier than any missed meeting or failed deal could ever have been. Min-jun did not move. He did not breathe properly for what felt like a long time. When he finally looked at the boys again, it was not as strangers and not as coincidence, but as pieces of his own life he had never known existed. His knees weakened slightly, and for the first time in more years than he could count, tears filled his eyes as he whispered their names back to her, one by one, like truth finally arriving home far too late. The boys, understandably, did not know what to make of any of it. Liam studied him with open curiosity, asking his mother quietly who this man was and why he looked so much like all three of them at once. Noah leaned in for a closer look, murmuring that he looked familiar in a way none of them could explain. Ethan, the most cautious of the three, gripped Elena's sleeve tighter and asked if the man was dangerous, a question that landed on Min-jun harder than any boardroom failure ever had, because in that single sentence, he understood exactly what he had become to his own sons: a stranger. When he knelt down and told them gently that he was their father, the words did not land as celebration. They landed as confusion, and Ethan took a small step backward, and that reaction, more than anything else that day, was what finally broke him completely. Behind him, his assistant was pale and pleading that the ceremony would begin any minute, and that the guests, the board, and both families were already waiting, but Min-jun barely turned to acknowledge her. For the first time in his adult life, other people's schedules meant absolutely nothing to him. He turned back to Elena and asked her to tell him everything, not as an explanation of the past, but as a wound finally being allowed to speak. And she did, walking him slowly through every year he had missed. The fear, the shame, the quiet nights of raising 3 boys alone, and the version of strength she had built simply because there had been no other option left to her. When his assistant's voice broke through again, announcing that they would arrive at the venue in minutes, Min-jun finally turned fully toward the convoy and said the words that would end up on every news channel in the country by nightfall. "Cancel it," he said, and when she stared at him in disbelief, he said it again, louder, with a certainty that silenced even the security team standing closest to him. "Cancel the wedding. Cancel all of it." Then, almost as an afterthought, even he didn't fully understand yet, he turned to his assistant and gave her a second instruction, quieter than the first, but just as absolute, telling her to call the most sought-after stylist in the city and have her meet them at the venue within minutes, along with the finest gown and accessories that could be arranged on such short notice, and proper suits for 3 boys who had never worn anything like them in their lives. His assistant, still stunned from the first order, only nodded and reached for her phone. Then he turned back to Elena and the boys and asked them, simply, to come with him, not to hide, not to wait somewhere quiet until the chaos passed, but to come with him to the one place where the truth needed to be spoken out loud. The venue was a masterpiece of gold and white, filled with politicians, executives, and media figures from 3 continents, built for a story of perfection that was about to become something else entirely. When Min-jun walked in, holding nothing but the truth, every conversation in the hall stopped at once. His father stepped forward first, furious, demanding to know the meaning of the disgrace unfolding in front of hundreds of guests. But Min-jun walked past him without a word and stepped up to the microphone at the center of the stage. "This wedding is canceled," he said, and the gasp that followed rolled through the hall like a wave. "Everything that was arranged here today, every agreement, every expectation, I am ending it, Because I have just learned the truth about the last 11 years of my life, and I will not build a marriage on top of a lie the way my family once built silence on top of one. To everyone's surprise, the woman waiting at the altar stepped forward calmly rather than in tears, admitting with something close to relief that she had never wanted this marriage either, that her own family had pressured her into it, and that she already loved someone else entirely. She set down her bouquet and walked out of the hall without looking back, and somewhere in the chaos that followed, two people who had never truly wanted this wedding both found their way out of it at the same time. But Min Jun's eyes were already searching for Elena, and when she finally stepped into the hall with the boys close behind her, the noise around them seemed to fade into the background. He walked to her slowly, then knelt down in front of everyone, press and family and strangers alike, and told her that he did not want power without her, and that he did not want a future built on anything less than the truth. Elena's eyes filled with tears as he asked her to marry him, not out of obligation, but because she was the truth he had been missing for 11 years. And this time, for the first time, she did not run. She said yes, quietly, and the hall around them erupted into noise that neither of them fully heard, because the only sound that mattered to either of them in that moment was each other's voice. While the stunned guests were ushered from the ceremony hall into the reception space next door, still whispering and reaching for their phones, Elena and the boys were quietly led backstage, where the stylist Min Jun had summoned was already waiting with a small team and a rack of gowns pulled together in record time. Elena tried at first to wave it away, telling them she didn't need any of it, that she had already said yes in the only clothes that mattered. But Min Jun took her hand gently and told her this had nothing to do with needing it, that he simply wanted the world to see her exactly as she deserved to be seen, not as a secret finally revealed, but as the woman he intended to spend the rest of his life introducing with pride. Half an hour later, when the doors to the reception opened, the room fell silent for the second time that day, this time for an entirely different reason, as Elena walked in wearing a gown that caught the light with every step, her hair and jewelry unhurried and exquisite despite the impossible timeline, with Liam, Noah, and Ethan beside her in perfectly tailored suits, straightening their own cuffs with the proud, slightly bewildered look of boys who had never worn anything so fine in their lives. Cameras that had spent all morning chasing scandal now scrambled for an entirely different kind of photograph, and as the four of them crossed the room toward Min Jun, even the guests who had come dressed for a different bride altogether found themselves rising to applaud. Min Jun's vows were short, almost plain compared to the speech he had once planned to give at a wedding that meant nothing to him. But every word of it was true. And when he told Elena that he had spent 11 years chasing everything except the one thing that mattered, and that he intended to spend the rest of his life making up for it, she did not need him to say anything more than that. Lady Diane June arrived too late to stop any of it, watching from the entrance as the life she had spent years constructing came apart in front of her. And for the first time, she understood that she had not protected her son at all. She had simply cost him 11 years he would never get back. Quietly, without a word to anyone, she turned and left before the doors closed behind her. The following morning, every major network across Asia, Europe, and North America was running some version of the same headline, describing a billionaire abandoning his own wedding after discovering a secret family, and for several days the story consumed every screen it touched. Analysts speculated about his mental state, investors worried aloud about the stability of his companies, and the elite circles that had once celebrated him now whispered instead about scandal. Reporters camped outside the estate gates for nearly a week, hoping for a single photograph of Elena or the boys, until Min-jun finally released one short, calm statement asking the public for privacy while his family adjusted to a life none of them had chosen under a spotlight. He did not defend himself, and he did not explain the details of what his mother had done, choosing instead to protect Elena and the boys from becoming a story that strangers argued over online. Slowly, without new material to feed on, the noise began to fade, first into curiosity, then into the ordinary silence of a news cycle that had already moved on to something else. And inside the quiet walls of the estate, none of that noise had ever really mattered anyway. The weeks that followed were not easy, but they were, for the first time in a long while, real. Min-jun moved into a quiet estate outside the city with Elena and the boys, trading press conferences for breakfast tables and boardrooms for bedtime stories he had never learned how to tell. Liam grew bolder with him almost immediately, asking endless questions about how businesses worked and how buildings were built. Noah brought him little drawings and half-finished inventions with the kind of pride that made Min-jun's chest ache in the best way. Ethan remained the most careful of the three, watching from a slight distance for weeks before finally, one quiet afternoon in the garden, reaching out and taking his father's hand without being asked. It was a small thing, but it meant more to Min-jun than any deal he had ever closed. When the boys started at a new school that autumn, the adjustment was harder than either parent expected. Classmates who had seen their father's face on every news channel treated them differently at first, some overly curious and others distant in a way that stung more than outright teasing would have. Liam came home one afternoon quieter than usual, admitting only after some coaxing that a boy in his class had suggested his mother had planned the whole thing to get money out of a rich man, and June had to sit with his own anger for a long moment before he trusted himself to answer calmly. He told Liam plainly that people would sometimes tell a version of a story that wasn't true, and that the only thing that truly mattered was that Liam knew the real one himself. He did not go to the school demanding an apology, though every instinct in him wanted to. Instead, he let Liam handle it his own way the following week, and when his son came home quietly proud of himself for simply telling the truth and walking away rather than fighting about it, Min-jun understood that his boy was already braver than he himself had been at that age. Elena, for her part, carried her own quiet weight, even in the calm. One evening, as the boys played inside and the sky turned soft gold above the garden, Min-jun found her sitting alone and asked what she was thinking about. "I never expected life to give me a second chance like this," she admitted, and when he told her gently that life hadn't given it to them, that they had fought for it themselves, she smiled, but the worry in her eyes didn't fully disappear. "What if it breaks again?" she asked quietly, and he answered honestly that he didn't know, only that if it did, they would fix it again, together, because it was worth fixing. Not every day at the estate was gentle. Nearly a month in, an old business associate of Min-jun's mother visited under the pretense of goodwill, only to remark carelessly in front of Elena that some people simply weren't built for a life like this one, and that the boys would eventually feel out of place among people of a different standing. Elena said nothing in the moment, but that night she packed a small bag out of instinct before she had even decided what she was doing, old fear rising in her the way it always did when she felt like a guest in someone else's life rather than a permanent part of it. Min-jun found her sitting on the edge of the bed with the bag half packed and did not raise his voice or ask her to explain herself. He simply sat down beside her and asked what she needed from him in that moment. And when she admitted, almost angrily, that she was terrified of being discarded again the way she once had been, he did not argue with her fear or tell her it was unreasonable. He told her that he understood exactly why she would think that, and that he intended to spend as many years as it took proving to her, patiently and without complaint, that this time was different. She did not unpack the bag that night, but she did not leave either, and by morning it was sitting empty in the closet, and neither of them mentioned it again. Meanwhile, the company Min-jun had built for over a decade did not collapse the way everyone had warned it would. In an emergency board meeting days later, he stood at the head of a long, polished table and told the room plainly that the wedding was canceled permanently and that his priorities had changed. And when one executive warned that it would destabilize a key business alliance, he answered simply that he no longer cared, that he had spent 11 years building a company with discipline and control, and had lost 11 years of his own life doing it, and he would not lose another day pretending to be fine with a life built on lies. To everyone's surprise, the company steadied rather than faltered, guided now by a version of him that made slower, more human decisions, and people who had once feared him began, quietly, to respect him in a different way. One senior board member, an older man who had worked alongside Min-jun's father for decades, pressed him further before the meeting ended, asking bluntly whether the boys would eventually expect a place within the company, and whether that expectation might one day complicate succession. Min-jun answered without hesitation that his sons would be given the same thing he intended to give every other decision from now on, which was honesty rather than entitlement, and that if any of them wanted a future in the company, they would earn it the same way anyone else would, starting from the bottom and proving themselves on merit rather than surname. The older man studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly, admitting that it was the first answer in years that had actually made him trust the family's judgment again. It was a small exchange, but it told the rest of the room everything they needed to know about the kind of leader Min-jun intended to become. Then, one afternoon, everything shifted again. A handwritten letter arrived from Lady Diane, and after reading it alone in his study for a long time without moving, Min-jun told Elena simply that his mother was sick, seriously enough that she was asking to see all of them together. Elena asked him gently, before the visit, whether he understood why his mother had done what she did all those years ago, and Min-jun admitted that he was only beginning to. Lady Diane had married into the family at 19, into a household where love had always come second to reputation, and she had spent 3 decades believing that protecting her son meant controlling every variable in his life before it could embarrass or endanger him. She had not set out to destroy anything. She had simply never learned another way to show care. And by the time she understood the difference between protecting someone and owning their choices, 11 years had already been lost because of it. That understanding did not excuse what she had done, but it gave Min-jun something he needed before walking back into that room, which was the ability to be angry with her without losing the ability to forgive her. The visit happened 2 days later in a quieter, smaller room than the one his mother had once ruled from, her voice softer now, her pride worn thin by time and regret. When the boys walked in, she looked at them the way someone looks at a second chance they never believed they deserved, whispering that they all looked so much like their father before her eyes filled with tears, and she admitted simply that she had been wrong. "You were not just wrong," Min-jun said quietly, standing beside Elena. "You changed everything." Lady Diane nodded, unable to argue, and turned to Elena directly to admit that she had judged her without ever knowing her at all. Elena answered honestly that she, too, had believed a lie without ever asking for the truth behind it, and for a long moment neither woman spoke. Then Ethan, in his simple, unguarded way, walked closer to his grandmother and asked if she was going to be okay. And when she nodded through her tears, he told her gently not to be sad anymore. It wasn't forgiveness exactly, not all at once, but it was the beginning of it, and sometimes that is enough. It was Noah, one rainy evening a few weeks after the school incident, who finally asked Elena the question all three boys had clearly been carrying for a while, wanting to know why she had never once told them anything about their father before that day on the crossing, not even his name. Elena set down what she was doing and sat with them properly before answering, telling them honestly that for many years she had believed their father did not want them, and that she had made a choice to protect them from a rejection she thought would hurt them, far more than simply not knowing would. She admitted it plainly, that she had been wrong to decide that on their behalf, without ever giving them the chance to know the truth themselves, and that she was sorry for the years of questions she had quietly avoided answering. Liam asked if she regretted it, and she thought about the question seriously, before answering that she did not regret protecting them when she believed protection was needed, but that she deeply regretted how long her own fear had lasted, after the reason for it had already stopped being true. Ethan, ever the quiet observer, simply said that he was glad they knew now, and asked if that meant she wasn't scared anymore. Elena told him, honestly, that she was getting better at it every single day, and that having all of them together was the reason why. As the months passed, the estate stopped feeling like a place of recovery and slowly became something else entirely. A home. Not a perfect one, and not one without its scars, but one that was undeniably alive. And through it all, there was one debt neither Min Jun nor Elena had forgotten. One they both agreed needed to be repaid properly, rather than simply spoken about in passing. Grandma Mira still lived in the same small house on the quiet edge of the city where she had taken in a frightened, pregnant young woman with nowhere else to go, asking for nothing in return but offering everything she had. She was in her garden trimming a row of small flowers when the cars pulled up outside, and she nearly dropped her shears when she saw Elena step out first, followed by 3 tall, familiar-looking boys, and then, unmistakably, by the man whose face had been on every news channel in the country only months earlier. Elena crossed the yard quickly and pulled the older woman into her arms before either of them could say a single word, and for a moment they simply stood there, holding on to each other the way people do when words feel too small for what they actually mean. When Elena finally stepped back, her eyes were wet, and she told Grandma Mira that she had never once forgotten what she had done for her, that a stranger's kindness on the worst night of her life had given her and her sons a chance at everything that came afterward. Grandma Mira waved her off gently, saying she had only done what anyone with a spare room and a working conscience should have done. But Min Jun stepped forward before she could dismiss it entirely. "You gave her shelter when no one else would," he said, his voice thick with something he didn't try to hide. "You cared for my sons before I even knew they existed. There is no amount of thanks that covers that, but I intend to spend a long time trying anyway." He told her that the boy's education, her home, and her care for as long as she lived were already taken care of, quietly and without conditions, not as a transaction, but as a debt he was finally able to repay. Grandma Mira's hands trembled slightly as she looked between the 3 boys, who had grown from the babies she once rocked to sleep into the tall, laughing young sons standing in front of her now. And when Liam stepped forward, and hugged her without being asked. She finally allowed herself to cry. Not from sadness, but from the simple, overwhelming relief of watching a story she had helped begin finally arrive somewhere good. That evening, Min-jun stood on the balcony of the estate with Elena beside him, the city glowing faintly in the distance, and told her quietly that if he had never seen her at that crossing, none of this would exist at all. She finished the thought for him gently, agreeing that it wouldn't, and he added, just as softly, that he had seen her, and that seeing her had changed absolutely everything. She leaned her head against his shoulder and told him not to stop, and for the first time in longer than he could remember, Min-jun felt no emptiness left inside his chest at all. He simply felt present, in the one life that had always been meant to be his. 4 years later, the estate looked much the same, except for the height of the boys now leaning against the garden fence, taller and louder and more sure of themselves than the cautious children who had once watched Min-jun from a careful distance. Liam had taken to following him into the study some evenings, asking sharper questions now about how the company worked, less out of curiosity and more out of something that looked like ambition of his own. Noah had filled an entire shelf with the small inventions he no longer needed to show anyone for approval, simply because he loved making them. Ethan, once the most guarded of the three, had somehow become the one who reached for his father's hand first at the end of a long day without a second thought, as though the distance between them had never existed at all. Grandma Mira visited every few weeks without fail, refusing every offer to move permanently into the main house until the winter she finally agreed, on the condition that she be allowed to keep her own garden exactly as she liked it, and nobody argued with her about it for a single day. On a quiet evening that spring, the whole family gathered on the same balcony where Min-jun had once stood alone with his emptiness. Only now the balcony was full, Elena beside him with her hand resting easily in his, the boys arguing cheerfully over something on the lawn below, and Grandma Mira laughing from her chair by the door at whatever nonsense had started the argument in the first place. Min-jun looked out at all of it for a long moment, the same city lights stretching into the same distance they always had, and understood, finally and completely, that the emptiness he had carried for 11 years had never been about ambition or success at all. It had simply been the absence of exactly this. In the years that followed, people stopped calling it a scandal and began calling it something else entirely, a turning point, the story of a billionaire who once left his own wedding to find a family he never knew he had, a woman who survived betrayal and rebuilt a life out of almost nothing, 3 boys who grew up learning both strength and love in equal measure, a mother who finally understood that control was never the same thing as care, and an old woman who gave shelter to a stranger and, without ever meaning to, helped raise a family that would one day come back to thank her. Because in the end, no one remembered the wedding that never happened. They remembered the moment a man stopped the car and chose the truth instead. If you enjoyed this love story, please like, comment, and subscribe to see more heartfelt tales. Your support helps us continue creating the stories that make your heart race.